A mile of ice is hard to hide, but a 1513 map drawn on gazelle skin shows the Antarctic coast as it looks without the frost. In 1960, the Strategic Air Command confirmed the geography was precise, meaning that somebody had mapped the continent before human history officially began. In this episode, I'm diving into the Piri Reis archive, the lieutenant colonel's letter that validated a lost civilization, and the 2024 study showing that plant life is currently exploding across the rock. The ice is melting, and it's revealing a snapshot of a world we weren't supposed to know existed. You won't want to miss this one. On October 9th of 1929, a man named Halil Edhem was standing inside the dusty, chaotic library of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, Turkey. Halil was the director of national museums for the country, and the reason he was in this mess was because the Turkish government had recently decided to convert this massive ancient palace into a public museum. However, before they could open the doors to the public, they had to catalog everything, and that was a nightmare. Now, this palace had been the headquarters of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. It was huge, and over those hundreds of years, the sultans and their staff had basically just shoved documents and maps and charts into random corners and cabinets and forgot about them. So Halil is surrounded by stacks of old paper and debris, and he's exhausted. He's been doing this for weeks already, and so he walked over to a dark corner of the room where there was this pile of what looked like rubbish, and it was just a stack of discarded materials that had been ignored for who knows how long now. And he reached down and he grabbed a bundle of documents and he dusted them off and he began sifting through them one by one. I mean, most of it was junk, just old administrative papers that didn't matter. But then near the bottom of the stack, his hand brushed against something that felt different. It wasn't paper, it was like leather. And so he pulled this object out of the stack and he held it up to the light. And he could see that it was a piece of gazelle skin parchment, and it was rolled really tight. It looked old. I mean, really old. So he carefully cleared off the space on a nearby table, and he set the gazelle skin down very gently, and he began to carefully unroll it. And as he flattened it out, he saw that this was clearly a map, or at least a piece of a map. It looked like it had been torn off a much larger chart from a long time ago. The colors were still bright, reds and greens and blues, and it was covered in very intricate illustrations of ships and animals and kings sitting on thrones. So he leaned in closer to try and read the writing, and he could tell that it was Ottoman Turkish, and he saw the date. It was dated to the Islamic year of 919, which translates to 1513 AD. And then there was a signature. It was signed by a man named Piri Reis, who was a famous admiral in the Ottoman Navy. Now, finding a 400-year-old map is cool, but Halil didn't think it was earth-shattering until he actually looked at what the map was showing. He recognized the right side of the map immediately. It showed the coast of West Africa and Spain. I mean, that made sense because in 1513, everybody knew where Africa and Spain were. But then Halil looked to the left side of the map and he froze because he was looking at the coast of Brazil, and he saw the Amazon River, and he saw the Andes Mountains, and he saw the Caribbean Islands, and he stared at it and he's doing the math in his head trying to figure out how it's possible. Now again, this map was drawn in 1513. Christopher Columbus had only stumbled onto the Bahamas in 1492, which was 20 years earlier. And yet, here was this Admiral Piri Reis drawing the coastline of South America with a level of detail that shouldn't have even been possible. In 1513, most explorers were still crashing their ships into rocks because they didn't know what was out there. But this looked like it had been drawn from a satellite. And in fact, he was so excited, he called a German scholar who just happened to be in Istanbul at the time, a guy by the name of Gustav Deismann, and the two of them stood over this table looking at this gazelle skin, realizing they had just only found the surviving map that reinforced Columbus's lost charts. It was a massive historical discovery. But as they were obsessing over the Amazon and the accuracy of the longitude, which, by the way, humans wouldn't figure out how to calculate accurately for another 250 years, Halil's eyes drifted to the very bottom of the map, and he suddenly noticed that the coastline of South America didn't stop. In fact, it kept going south, and then it turned east, and it curled along the bottom of the map, creating a massive landmass that ran along the Southern Ocean. And he looked at it, and he saw that Piri Reis had drawn mountains down there. He had drawn rivers, he had even written little notes about the climate, and one note said it was very hot. Another note warned about big snakes living in this southern land. And he and the German scholar just looked at the bottom section and they shrugged. They figured, all right, the admiral was a genius with South America, but he just clearly made up this bottom part. Well, first, we need to go back to the 1500s, because map makers had this theory called Terra Australis. They believed there had to be a big continent at the bottom of the world to balance out all the land at the top of the world. But they had never seen it. They just guessed that it was there. So Halil assumed that that's what this was. He figured Piri Reis just ran out of real data and started drawing mythical lands with snakes and hot weather to fill up the empty space. So he rolled the map back up, he cataloged it, and he announced the discovery to the world, focusing entirely on the Americas. He didn't know it at the time, but he had just dismissed the most important part of the map. He thought the snakes in the hot land were a mistake, but he was wrong. Now fast forward 27 years to 1956. We are now in the office of a man named Charles Hapgood. You see, he was the professor of the history of science at the Keene State College in New Hampshire. And Hapgood was a very buttoned-up academic. He cared only about facts and evidence. But on this day, he was sitting at his desk, staring at a copy of that same gazelle skin map that Halil had found in the rubbish pile in Istanbul. And a student had actually mentioned the map to Hapgood during a class, asking about its accuracy. And Hapgood, being a good, diligent teacher, decided that, he really needed to study it so he could give a proper answer. So he got a high-quality copy, he laid it out on his desk, and he started doing what Halil hadn't done. He began looking carefully at the notes. See, Piri Reis hadn't just drawn a map. He had written all over the margins in Ottoman Turkish, basically explaining his work. He was citing his sources. And when Hapgood got these notes translated, he realized the admiral was being incredibly transparent about how he made this thing. Piri Reis wrote that he didn't go out and survey the whole world himself. Instead, he admitted that this map was actually a compilation. He had actually gathered about 20 older maps, and he called them Jafarieh maps, and he stitched them together to create this one master chart. Now, he said that some of the maps were recent, like the ones from Christopher Columbus, but then in a note that Hapgood found very strange, the admiral wrote that some of the source maps dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. So Hapgood just sat in his chair, and he realized that, well, Alexander the Great lived in the 4th century BC, which meant Piri Reis was claiming that parts of his map were based on data that was nearly 2,000 years old. Now, normally a historian would read that and think, okay, the admiral is bragging. He's trying to make his map sound ancient and important, but Hapgood couldn't dismiss it that easily, because he looked at the bottom of the map again, and he looked at the strange landmass that curled off the tip of South America and ran eastward. Now, by 1956, everybody knew what was at the bottom of the world. It was Antarctica. Antarctica had been officially discovered in 1820, about 300 years after Piri Reis drew this map. So logically, Hapgood thought, okay, Piri Reis drew Antarctica 300 years before anybody saw it. Well, that should be impossible. But then he read the specific note the admiral had written right over the southern landmass. And the note said, "There is no trace of cultivation. Everything is desolate, and big snakes are said to be there. It is very hot." Hapgood read that and he thought, snakes, hot weather in Antarctica? I mean, it was ridiculous, because Antarctica is the coldest place on Earth. It is covered in a sheet of ice a mile thick. The temperature drops to 100 degrees below zero. So how was this possible? It's a frozen wasteland. And in that moment, Hapgood did exactly what Halil Edhem had done back in 1929. He just rationalized it. He thought, okay, the Admiral got lucky. He drew a blob at the bottom of the world because he thought there should be a land there, and he just guessed. He didn't know any better. He assumed it was hot and full of snakes like the jungles in South America. Simple explanation, right? Hapgood was ready to roll up the map and put it away and just tell his students that it was just a lucky guess mixed with some medieval mythology. But right before he put it away, he took one last look at the coastline of that fake continent and he stopped. Usually, when map makers guess, they draw vague round blobs, they draw clouds, they draw straight lines, but Peri Reyes hadn't done any of that. He had drawn a very specific jagged coastline with bays and peninsulas, and there were even islands off the coast. And he had drawn mountain ranges inland. It didn't look like somebody guessed. It looked like a survey. So, he leaned in again, tracing the line with his finger, and it looked so real, but it didn't match the Antarctica that was on the globe in Hapgood's classroom. The Antarctica on the globe was round and smooth because of the ice shelf, but this showed something else. And so he just couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than he knew. But to do any further research, he needed data that basically didn't exist yet, or at least he thought it didn't exist. Well, as it turns out, the military had just found it. So Hapgood began digging, and he knew that if he was going to prove this map wasn't just a fantasy, he needed to know what the actual rock coastline of Antarctica looked like. Not the coastline that everybody sees on a globe, but the actual bedrock buried underneath. But in 1956, that information was nearly impossible to find. However, Hapgood eventually found a report from a very recent, very specific military operation. It was the Norwegian, British, Swedish expedition of 1949. Now, this wasn't just a bunch of guys hiking in the snow. It was actually a high-tech survey mission. They had gone down to a part of Antarctica called Queen Maud Land that seemed to be depicted on the bottom of the Peri Reyes map. And while they were down there, these scientists used a technique called seismic sounding, which means they would drill a hole in the ice, they would drop an explosive charge down there and set it off. And then they would measure how long it took for the echo of the explosion to bounce off the solid rock at the bottom and come back up to the surface. And by doing this over and over again across the continent, they were able to create a rough map of the topography hidden underneath the ice cap. And so Hapgood got his hands on this seismic data and he laid it out on a table next to the Peri Reyes map. And he looked at the 1513 map first, and then he traced that jagged coastline again, and he saw where the Admiral had drawn a deep bay cutting inland. He saw where he had drawn a chain of islands off the coast and where he had drawn a mountain range rising up from the shore. And then Hapgood looked over at the 1949 seismic map. On the surface, in 1949, that part of Queen Maud Land was a flat white sheet. There was none of the stuff that Peri Reyes had drawn. However, the seismic data showed something else. It showed that underneath that mile of ice, the bedrock dipped down to form a deep bay, and that there were rock peaks jutting up from the ocean floor that were currently buried. But if the ice were gone, they would be islands. It showed a massive mountain range exactly where the Admiral had drawn one. And immediately it's like, this can't be possible. So he grabbed a piece of tracing paper and he traced the outline of the subglacial bedrock from the 1949 report, the land that no human eye had seen for what they believed was millions of years. And then he placed that tracing over the Peri Reyes map. And my God, they matched. It wasn't just close, it was precise. You see, the Admiral hadn't drawn the ice, he had drawn the land. And that presented a terrifying problem, because according to every geologist on Earth, the Antarctic ice cap formed millions of years ago, which meant that the last time the coastline looked the way it did on the Peri Reyes map, with bays and islands and mountains exposed to the air, was before human history even began. And so he began to wrestle with the terrifying realization that whoever this guy was from 1513 didn't just make a lucky guess. Somehow, he had gotten access to a source map that was drawn by someone who saw Antarctica before it froze. Immediately, he knew that if he went to his colleagues at the time and said, "Hey, I think an ancient civilization mapped Antarctica 6,000 years ago," I mean, come on, they would laugh him out of the building. He would lose his credibility as a history professor. And speaking of which, because he was a history professor and not a geologist, he needed some serious backup. He needed somebody with an impeccable authority, just to confirm that he wasn't crazy. So he needed the United States Air Force. So he gathered up all his notes, his tracings, the copies of the Perry-Reyes map, and the data, and he put it all into a package and mailed it to the one group of people he knew couldn't be fooled: the 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron of the Strategic Air Command, or SAC, stationed at Westover Air Force Base in Massachusetts. Now, in 1960, the Cold War was in full swing. The 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron wasn't a history club. They were responsible for mapping the entire globe for the United States military. It was their job. They had to ensure that if the president ordered a nuclear strike, a missile launched from a silo in North Dakota and would fly halfway around the world and hit a specific street corner in Moscow, they needed that exact precision and data. All they cared about was geography. And so Hapgood knew that if there was a flaw in his theory, or if he had somehow messed up longitude calculations, or maybe he was seeing patterns in the ink that wasn't really there, these were the guys that would find it. And he hoped that that was true, because if they came back and said, "Professor, you're wrong, this is just a drawing of South America that got bent out of shape," then he can go back to his normal life and he could stop obsessing over the map. So he sent off the package and he waited. And weeks went by. Hapgood went about his classes, teaching history, grading papers, but in the back of his mind, he was always thinking about that envelope sitting on some colonel's desk at the Air Force Base. And in his mind, he just imagined some analyst looking at it, laughing at a history professor who thought a 400-year-old gazelle skin showed the bottom of the world. I mean, he figured when the response finally came, it would be very polite and dismissive. And then, on July 6th, 1960, a letter arrived at Keene State College. Hapgood picked it up, and he saw the return address. It was from them. He took a deep breath, he sat down at his desk, and he used a letter opener to slice open the top, and he pulled out the single sheet of typed paper inside. He unfolded it, and he saw the signature at the bottom: Lieutenant Colonel Harold Z. Oldmeyer, USAF Commander. So he adjusted his glasses and he began to read. And as he read the first paragraph, he stopped breathing, because the colonel wasn't laughing nor dismissing him. The colonel was confirming everything, and this is what the letter said. And keep in mind, this is a direct quote from an official United States Air Force document. Colonel Oldmeyer wrote this: "The claim that the lower part of the map portrays the Princess Martha coast of Queen Maud Land, Antarctica, and the Palmer Peninsula is reasonable. We find that this is the most logical and in all probability the correct interpretation of the map." Hapgood read that sentence twice. The Air Force was agreeing with him. They were looking at the same jagged lines he was and seeing the same thing. But it was the next paragraph that completely sealed the deal. The colonel continued: "The geographical detail shown in the lower part of the map agrees very remarkably with the results of the seismic profile made across the top of the ice cap by the Swedish, British, Norwegian Antarctic expedition of 1949. This indicates the coastline had to have been mapped before it was covered by the ice cap." And then the colonel delivered the final blow. The ice cap in this region is now about 1 mile thick. We have no idea how the data on this map can be reconciled with the supposed state of geographical knowledge in 1513. Hapgood put the letter down. The United States military had just confirmed that a map drawn in 1513 depicted the coastline of Antarctica as it looks without ice. And they confirmed that the only way to get that data was to physically map the coast before the ice arrived, which meant that Perry-Reyes wasn't crazy. When he wrote notes about big snakes and hot weather, he wasn't making it up. He was copying data from a source map that was drawn when Antarctica was actually hot, when it was green and full of life. But according to geology, the last time it was ice-free was at least 6,000 years ago and possibly much, much longer. Long before the invention of the chronometer, long before the compass, and long before recorded history says human beings were capable of sailing the oceans, let alone mapping a continent with satellite-level precision. Hapgood realized that the Peri-Reyes map wasn't just a cool artifact. It was evidence of a lost chapter in human history, and it proved that somebody had been down there. Now, for years, people looked at Hapgood's theory and the Old Meyer letter as a fascinating anomaly, a kind of weird what if. But recently, the story of the Peri-Reyes map has moved from the history books to the front page of the news, because it looks like the ice that hid the coastline is finally starting to give back. In October of 2024, a team of scientists from the University of Exeter and the University of Hertfordshire actually published a study in the journal Nature Geoscience, and it basically broke the internet for people who follow it. These researchers have been meticulously analyzing satellite data of the Antarctic Peninsula, which is, mind you, the same area on the bottom of the Peri-Reyes map going back to 1986. And what they found was that vegetation in this area isn't just growing, it's exploding. According to their data, plant life on the peninsula has increased by more than 1,000% in the last few decades. In 2021 alone, the greening accelerated by over 30%. NASA's Earth Observatory confirmed these findings, releasing satellite images that show patches of green moss and algae spreading across the rock where, for many, many, many years, there was only white ice. Now, scientists claim that this is happening because of global warming. But if you look through the lens of Peri-Reyes and the Old Meyer letter, it tells a much scarier story. Now remember, for centuries, historians looked at the admiral's notes and dismissed them as myths, because Antarctica has been frozen for so long, humans should have never been able to have seen it green. But the United States Air Force admitted that the map accurately depicts the land under the ice. And so where are we now in 2026? We are watching the ice retreat. We are watching the continent turn green again, which suggests that this impossible map wasn't a mistake. It was a record. It was a snapshot of the last time the world looked like this, which implies that the frozen, barren Antarctica we have all known for all of humanity is actually the anomaly. The ice is just temporary, and the hot, green Antarctica described by the Admiral is the reality that is waiting to come back. So if the map is accurate, and the military says it is, then we have to accept the final implication. Sometime in the deep past, before the ice came, a civilization advanced enough